He will never let me go, never let me down. He will never let me go, never let me down.
Hey, what's up, family? Welcome to Dominate Your Day podcast. It's me, Apostle Tom McCray, man. I'm so excited to bring this next series of sessions, this podcast, to you because it's going to tie into our theme for the year, which is crossing over here at our church. And one of the things I shared was that there were a few principles that God gave me as a reminder to the body, to you who are listening, man, on what we have to do. How do we prepare to cross over? When I say cross over, I'm talking about crossing over into purpose. I shared this when I introduced this particular theme and focus for the year at our church going into this new year. So often we as children of God spend all of our life preparing for the promise. But as I said, man, Canaan was a place that Israel was supposed to actually occupy. In other words, this was supposed to be about a 2-week journey that they were going to move into the land that God promised Abraham and his descendants. And for whatever reason, their lack of faith, their doubt, got them stuck in the wilderness. An entire generation died short of occupying what God purposed for them to occupy. And I believe his church, this season, this hour, we are called to step into our purpose because that's where God is being glorified. All right, so I'm going to be sharing over the next few weeks, man, just a few focal scriptures, and we're going to break those things down. And so I'm glad I have a few people here with me today as we work through what we call Discipleship Live, right? So I got Lisa Smith, Brett Smith, they're here as guests with me today as we walk through. So I'm going to be talking to you, I'm going to be talking to them, we're going to interact. But most importantly, man, I want you to come away with these principles that God has given me, because this is instruction that God actually gave to Israel on how to make it when they got to the promised land, what they were actually supposed to do. So the first thing today we're going to talk about is what we need to be prepared to do. And anytime you're looking to come into anything that God has promised you, you have to be prepared to overcome fear and doubt. You have to be prepared to overcome fear and doubt, right? When God was bringing Israel, was looking to deliver them, they were standing here at the border of Canaan, and they were at the edge of the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army was approaching, and God gives them specific instructions. So we're going to look at a verse here, Exodus 14, verse 13 through 14. I'm going to read that, and we're just going to break that down a little bit and walk through it, right? So Exodus 14, verses 13 through 14 says, Moses answered the people, right, and said, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord will bring you today, right? So stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, he says, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Man, there's so much in this verse when we're talking about preparing ourselves to go into, right, to walk out of one thing and into what God has purposed for us. And here, the Israelites, as they face this seemingly impossible situation, in which we often encounter situations in our life, man, that seem insurmountable when we're trying to walk in the promises and the purposes of God, right? But this text actually gives us a framework for overcoming these particular obstacles. And so the first thing I want you to notice from the text is that the Lord says, do not be afraid, right? Do not be afraid. So in other words, we have to acknowledge what exists that is producing the fear, but reject its hold. So anytime we go, it's, sometimes people say, oh, don't be afraid. Like you're trying to ignore the very thing, right, that is challenging at that particular time that may be producing that fear. No, you should acknowledge what exists and what's producing the fear, but the focal point now is we have to reject its hold, right? He tells them specifically, right? He says this to them, do not be afraid. Okay, do not be afraid. While fear is a natural human emotion, especially when facing, man, like overwhelming situations, It is so crucial to not let fear dictate our actions. I mean, what do you guys think? Like, how often do we allow fear to dictate our actions when it comes to decisions?
Man, I would say daily.
Right?
If you don't recognize, you know, a lot of times I think we're driven by fear and don't even realize it. And I love that the scripture that you pointed out in Exodus 14. In this translation, it says, "The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent."
Wow.
And that's just a little bit different, but
Right.
it's just enough because the first thing I think that we do whenever we feel fearful is we try to like maneuver, right? Figure it out, say the right things,
Right.
do the right things to try to avoid, like you
Yeah.
said, that outcome of what that fear is trying to drive you to do.
Right.
Is exactly what we start doing.
Yeah, and we can't not allow fear to dictate or to drive us in those decisions, because here, just like we should, we're moving into something that God has promised. I mean, we talked about that, right? We talked about, man, like, what good is a promised land without a people to occupy it? And if somebody makes a promise, right, then it becomes the responsibility of the promisor to fulfill that promise. And we have to be mindful of that as children of God. And that's why I think God can say to his people, like, do not be afraid. Like, I promised this. I promised this to Abraham. I'm God. I'm going to keep my promises. So do not allow fear to dictate your actions or decisions, right? Then the next thing he says is stand firm in faith, right? So what do we got to do? One, acknowledge the fear, but reject its hold. The second thing is learn how to stand firm in faith that God's going to do what he said, right? Standing firm is a posture of confidence and faith. It means not giving in to panic or despair, right? But rather holding on to God's promise, standing firm in the midst of what's going on. As you said in that translation, Brett, like, man, just remain silent, just stand, right? And I know that's hard many times and difficult people to do. And it's even harder, though, when you don't have a relationship with the promiser. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like, listen, if you don't know God's heart and how he feels towards you, it is very difficult for you to hold on to a promise he's made when you have all of these obstacles and these challenges, right? So not only standing firm, but you have to, man, know the Father's heart for you, right? You have to know that if he promised you something, if he told you what he was going to do, he's going to do it. And that really brings me to the next point in this text. Is the third thing is you have to expect God's deliverance. You got to expect God to come through. Yeah. Right? He said, you will. I love this. He said, you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. So Moses is guaranteeing. He's like, look, guys, stay firm. Don't be afraid. Stand firm. And this is why. Because you're going to see God's deliverance today. You're going to see God operate and work on your behalf. Like, think about that. Go ahead.
So I know we were talking a couple of weeks ago, and I think the hard part is, at least in my experience, when we're trying to wait for that deliverance, when we're trying to keep silent, we're holding on to this idea of what we think should be happening.
Right.
And I think the question is, how do you know if you're waiting for God or if you just don't know what to do?
Man, I think that's a great question. And I think to some degree, if we're honest, while you're waiting on God, you're not going to know what to do. Sometimes it's just the standing firm, right? It's like, man, I don't know what to do. I'm just standing still to trust that God's going to either speak to me in this hour, he's going to show me, but until he does, all I have is to just stand here and trust him.
Yeah.
Right?
The other part to that was that, and we were talking about this with the kids, is that I feel like if you start to make moves out of that fear,
Yes.
it's essentially, you're doing what Adam and Eve did in the garden, where they decided, hey, I'll say what's good.
Right.
And God, you said it was going to be this, so this is what I'm going to do. But then it's misinterpreted, because now we're trying to execute God's will, but it's on our own without him.
Yeah, and we might even, and many times, man, become misplaced or displaced ourselves. Like, fear moves you here, and then God comes back like, where are you doing? Like, I'm parting it right here. Like, the door is opening right here. Yeah. But fear has caused you to do, and it's like God making a promise to Abraham, right? Like, hey, you're gonna have a child this time next year. Sarah gets the point. She looks at Abraham. She's old. She looks at Abraham. He's old, and she's like, "Man, how is God gonna do this?" Right? And I don't think it was so much fearful of him not being able, but still not standing still, not expecting God to do what He said. It's not your job to figure it out. It's just your job just to believe Him that He is faithful to what He promised. And so, somebody said, "What do I do?" Well, keep doing what you're doing, right? And just be faithful at it. So we're talking about, it could be an entrepreneur, it could be a person like, man, I know the purpose of God. God has called me to do this in my life, and you're working it, and God says, "Hey, look, I want you to start this company. I want you to start this and do it." It's not your job to figure out how He's going to bring that to pass. Like, where's the money and resources? Your job is to start. Look at it like the when it came to the Elisha and the woman had her sons that was about to sell in slavery. He told me, he says, "Look, what do you have in your house?" She said, "Oh, I got some oil." She's like, "Oh, go find as many jars as you can find." And she could be like, okay, the panic of losing her children could be like, how is this going to work? Right? But had she not been obedient to the instruction, fear could have caused her to not obey. Your job to pour. It's God's job to keep supplying the oil. You know what I'm saying? So I think for us, it's like, man, getting to the point to expect God to do exactly what He said He would do, and to know that He can accomplish it on His own. Our job is to trust Him, right? Go ahead, Lisa.
I love this because we read this knowing, right, that God created this miracle parting the seas, but they had no idea of what their deliverance would look like.
Exactly.
And so reading it through that eyes, like, man, they had no idea what it would look like. In fact, it's amazing. I love that He tells them to keep quiet. You must be quiet, because just before then they were like, were there not enough graves in Egypt that we couldn't have died in Egypt? But you bring us to this sea,
Yep.
and the Egyptians are behind us, and they're looking at this vast sea, not realizing God is about to perform one of the greatest
Yes.
miracles. I mean, literally, one of the greatest visuals of His glory through the sea.
And it's, you said it right when He said, "Man, like shh, like hush, be silent, be still," because sometimes fear will cause us to create more fear with our words, not realizing how we're diminishing our faith. So here we are. I know God promised me this, but man, look at this challenge, look at that challenge, and now here's the evil report, right? We can talk that thing up so much that now not only is it eating our faith, but even those that are supposed to be working with us, right? So we have to position ourselves to expect God to operate and to work on our behalf if we're going to cross over. The next thing here was, I love this. We have to learn to acknowledge God's ultimate power over our opposition. Acknowledge God's ultimate power over our opposition. It can be adversaries. It doesn't matter. He says this. He says, "The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again."
Yeah.
Right? So this part right here, this verse, it emphasizes God's power over, in their case, their adversaries. Right? But for us, the Egyptians can represent personal fears. It can represent challenging circumstances, right? But we have to know that ultimately, part of the reason that you can stand firm, stand still, and expect God's deliverance is because it's God. Like and it goes back to what I said. We have to know the promisor. We have to know the one that said, "This is what I have you to do. This is what I'm gonna do." And if He gives you the go ahead to move forward, this knowledge, this understanding that we have of Him is what gives us the confidence and the boldness, right? To silence fear, right? To not be gripped. It'd be different if somebody that you knew that didn't have the resources nor the ability to do something say, "Hey, don't be afraid." It's like, all right, man, hold on, I don't know you like that. I don't trust. But for God to tell you, right, or God's representative in this case, or Moses saying, "Do not be afraid," right? Because the enemy that you see, the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. So powerful. Right?
You know what I really value about that, and we were talking with the kids about that this morning, is that God being the promiser, but in covenant, He's also the executor. So when we think about like how we go to work and we have to work to get paid, that promise between our employers that if we do X, Y, and Z, then we get paid. But God's covenant with Abraham was literally just, this is what I'm going to do for you. Before He outlined anything, there was no commandments at this point. There was no There was only, hey, you know me because we've been journeying together. And this is what I'm offering you. I'm going to do this, 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 and this. And I'm going to guarantee it by myself. And you just have to be silent. You just have to be ready to move when it's time to go. And there's no expectation on us. And I think we lose that as soon as things get challenging. We're like, oh, I got to figure this out. That's how I honor God. And God's like, I didn't ask you to do that. I gave you what you needed. This is where we're going.
And it's powerful because that leads to the next point, right? Yeah. And he said it. He said, the Lord will fight for you. Mm-hmm. So the next one is we have to recognize that the battle belongs to the Lord. Whenever God tells you that this is what I'm going to do for you or through you or where I want you to be, at that point, like you said, not only is he promised, but he's the executor. And anyone that stands in the way of that, they become his opposition. Exactly. Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
Including ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And we have to be careful of that, that we don't. I mean, that's what they did. And we'll talk about another principle. They kind of put themselves in between by their words. Yeah. Right? But we have to understand, man, the battle belongs to the Lord. God made this promise to me. I didn't find it myself, and no, God spoke. He found us. This is what he created you to do. This is what I want you to do. This is what I'm going to do in your life. And now if he makes that promise, he now becomes the executor. Right? So in their situation, he says the battle belongs to the Lord, but we can take that same principle and says, well, if God told me this, then this is his fight. This is his doing. I'm just an instrument. I'm an agent. I'm a benefactor of what God's going to do. But this is his vision, right? This is his vision. And then the last point out of this verse I want to make is we have to embrace a posture of peace and trust, right? When it comes to crossing over, stepping into what God has purposed for us, we have to embrace a posture of peace and trust. Right? He says you need only to be still. Isn't that powerful? Like the only thing you need to do is to be still. You guys are standing here, and what's going to happen? Just be still. Yeah. Like don't mess it up with your words. Yeah. Don't run off. Don't. I shouldn't have to save people because half of y'all ran over here and half over here. Like that would have been a disaster in itself. They had to really trust Moses. He said, just only stand still. Right? And let me say this too. I want to, when we're talking about purpose, standing still is not just about inactivity, but it's more about tranquility, right? It's more about trusting in the midst of the turmoil, right? That's what the standing still is. It's a call to cease striving in our own strength and to rest in God's ability to do what he said. So it's not inactivity. Like you keep doing what you're doing, but just know that at some point that door is going to open, right? At some point, somebody's going to come knocking. At some point, that Red Sea is going to part. Yeah. And then you're going to be able to walk right over into what God has purposed for us. So Exodus 14, guys, 13 through 14, I'm challenging everybody to go back, look at this text, go back and look at these principles because it is a powerful framework for overcoming fear and doubt. Right? It's a powerful framework for overcoming fear and doubt. Right? So once again, we have to trust in God's promises, standing firm in faith, expecting his deliverance or expecting for him to manifest himself. We have to recognize his power and ultimate authority over against our opposition and understand that he fights our battles, right? And make sure that we embrace a posture of peace and trust. So guys, listen, until next time, I want you to make sure that you are applying these principles and you're actively moving in the crossover because faith without works is dead. And we don't want this to be a theme that we had at our church anniversary, right? And we talk about, oh, we're crossing over. And then everybody's going back into their everyday, what they were doing before. This is about stepping into the purpose, the destiny, the plan that God has for us. It is our season. It is our time. And as I said before, let me correct that. It's not just about season. This is what we are purposed for. This is our destiny, to occupy what God has purposed for in our life. All right. God bless you guys. Remember, man, dominate your purpose by dominating your day. You got the principles, walk in it. God bless.